Hi, and welcome to Unplanned, the show about cities and how they work. I'm Sam, your host. Remember to hit the subscribe button for plenty more interesting conversations to come. Today, we're going to dig into a really fascinating urban question, urban topic, and that is the topic of Nubian Square, which is right in the heart of Boston, and the Bruce Bolling Building, which sits right in the heart of Nubian Square. And we're not just doing this with any old two guests. We're doing this with two fabulous guests, and I'm going to introduce them to you right now. The first is Kairos Shen, who is the executive director for the MIT Center for Real Estate. And he has a long connection to this building from his former perch as the head of the BRA, the Boston Redevelopment Authority in Boston. And he'll give us a wonderful perspective. And we're also joined by Francine Houben, who is the architect of this amazing building, the Bolling Building. And she is the founding partner and creative director of Mecanoo in the Netherlands. I want to welcome you both to Unplanned. So Kairos, I'm going to start with you just because you have that local perspective. Why don't you kind of set the table for us? What are we talking about? Where are we talking about it? What's the building involved that we're talking about? Give us some background just so we can all understand where we're at.
Thank you, Sam. So first of all, for those of you who are from Boston, you would have cringed when Sam introduced me as the head of the BRA. While I was never the head of the BRA, I was the head of planning, the director of planning at the BRA for 13 years and was the chief planner for the city and worked for Mayor Menino. So just to set that straight, well, Dudley, what was Dudley Square is the heart of the African-American neighborhood, which is part of Roxbury in the city of Boston. It had been an important sort of commercial center for a long time, and then basically went downhill with the, essentially urban flight, and had seen a series of disinvestment in the second half of the 20th century. And it's been Roxbury, or right around what was then Dudley Square, was part of some of the urban renewal ideas. And during the 70s, late 60s, there was the planning of the Inner Belt Highway, of which cut right across and around Dudley Square, which is now the path of the highway was supposed to be along what is now Melnea Cass Boulevard. So, and there were a series of urban renewal plans around this area. Now, the bottom line is that even in the 70s, there was a kind of urban renewal around Dudley Square. And there were a number of things that are important part of the story, which was the public sector invested in building a new branch library, a new police station. And then, of course, there was the Dudley Station, which had always been an important part of the transportation hub, was also invested in. And then subsequently, Dudley Square, which had been a major part of the elevated Orange Line, in the 80s, it was taken down and moved to a different location. But
Kairos, we'll get into all of this. Let me pause you there because it's a lot to digest. There's a lot in there that you just were talking about. Let's get Francine in just to introduce her and hear her perspective, and then we'll come back to these various elements, including the urban renewal part, which of course is a big part of the story and the history. But Francine, why don't you just give us a brief sense of how you started to get involved from an architect's perspective? You were in the Netherlands. How did you get connected to all of this?
I think there was an open tender, so we could enter this. And I was interested. I had taught at Harvard, so I had been more often in Boston, and also a coincidence that one of my employees, her father used to live there. So it's always this coincidence. So I really went after it, and also for me, walking through through Roxbury, what at that time still was called that part, Dudley Square, was for me like, I started my office in the 80s, and that was really the urban renewal in the Netherlands. So for me, walking around just all alone through that neighborhood, I felt, I felt at home. It really did remember me to my the urban renewal in the 80s in the Netherlands, and I did like to talk to the people. I was also very much observing with all my senses. That part of the city. So I was also amazed how many blind walls, and I didn't understand how was that possible. Later I heard, I think from Kairos, that people had put fire in certain buildings to get money from insurance companies. And it was very amazing. I imagine that Boston has a kind of good name for me from Europe. But then this area was very strange, but also that at the same time it's a mobility hub, and I was watching, the people sitting on the bus station, and in a very uncomfortable bus station, and at
And
the same
Francine, what year was that you were visiting and walking
oh,
around the neighborhood and sort of seeing it?
Iris, do you know the year?
2008 was the first
First time.
competition that was launched by the city. And I remember meeting Francine at first time was at the interview of the competition. So
So
2008.
I
yeah,
didn't
no,
know
go ahead. Go ahead.
anybody.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's nice you mentioned this, because I remember I didn't know anybody. So we had to find. So I was really observing that area. I felt very much I can do this. I can handle these neighborhoods, or handle. I like it. And at the same time, we did select a local partner. So we selected Sasaki to team up with, and then we had this
Well,
interview.
before we get into the competition and the design, Kairos, let's bounce it back to you and get the setup for the whole situation now. So
Yeah.
you've given us so much in there with the transportation and the urban renewal. Now you're at the city. You've corrected me. You were the director of planning at the BRA. What was going on? What was the
So
story?
let's put it this way. The simple thing was that Mayor Menino had a personal connection to Dudley Square. It was a place where he traveled from Hyde Park to play basketball with in the middle of the city. And he was, for all the years he was mayor, he was always very concerned about the revitalization of Dudley Square. So there were many efforts that he tried to launch to try to redevelop the main part of Dudley Square. There were a number of schemes with different from Governor Weld on. And then
Kara, sorry. I just want to, for people who don't know some of the history, some of these players, can you give us rough dates, times when
this
all
was
this was?
the first agreement to redevelop Dudley Square was with Governor Weld back in the late 90s, right? And the idea was that the city would make one of its parcels available, and that the Department of Public Health would move and develop a building not on Ferdinand itself, but on an adjacent parcel, and really to bring more energy and people and activity into Dudley Square. Now, the bottom line is that failed, right? Governor Romney pulled the plug on that project because he said, instead of building office space in Dudley Square, the state could rent cheaper office space elsewhere. So the mayor in 2006 said, I'm going to do this, and the city owns a parcel between the police station and an adjacent parcel. The city would redevelop Dudley Square by doing what he called the 3-point plan. Number one, redeveloped the police station, which was a 1970s bunkers, like a bunker-like building, right? Redevelop what was then an adjacent parcel, and then build potentially a parking garage, and then also potentially develop the Ferdinand site. So that was it. That was in 2006. That led to him essentially directing the BRA and the Department of Neighborhood Development or Public Facilities Department to launch a competition. And that's when the city put together this open call for competition, and led to a series of bidders and teams that included Francine.
Okay.
2008.
So yeah, no, fascinating. So now we should go back to Francine. The other piece that you've mentioned a couple of times is the Ferdinand building, and we'll have to talk about that because it is kind of this keystone in the urban design of the whole area there, and fascinating.
And
So
can
Francine,
I just say this?
yeah.
The most important thing about this was that this 3-point plan involved the redevelopment of public assets and public land, but also the taking of Ferdinand building and the site, which was privately owned because of its strategic location right at the where Warren Street and Washington Street splits, which is, you know, once you see it, you know how important this site is. It's really the prow of the ship of Dudley Square.
All right, so we'll get back. We'll get back to these sort of strategic questions, the sort of big picture strategic questions. So Francine, you saw this area. You decided you would put in a bid for this competition that the city of Boston was doing, and you decided to visit the space, the place. What did you see from an urban design, from a designer's perspective, from an architect designer? What were you working with? What was the palette that you had to work with when you came to Boston and looked?
First of for me is always observing, and that I saw all these, I've never seen so many blind walls together in an urban plot next to a mobility hub. Of course, I did observe all the people of Roxbury. What is felt like, Kairos just said, more Afro-American people, kind of jazzy. I felt a kind of energy in the people. Also, I did like the Ferdinand building, and I remember it was, so Ferdinand was standing there in a very proud and strong, because I think it was already empty for 40 years and it was still alive. And they did put in the windows, they had put in blue with blue paint. It was covered, and it was really Mecanoo blue. So I thought, this is for me. And so yeah, it gave me a lot of energy, and it, for me, it also remembered of the way I started Mecanoo. That was really the time of urban renewal. And I was also, I was there all alone, and I like to just walk around, talk to people, you know, what are their dreams? It was for them, of course, they all missed the High Line, was it the Orange Line? What was
the elevate, right?
Elevated
Kairos will know, but
yeah,
the elevate,
yeah.
right? That was an
Yeah,
elevated
the elevated
train.
train. They missed the elevated train, and they said it was always a place to come together more. And so that was for me important. But at the same time, I remember what was in the brief of the city was more an office block. So I said, how can we make an office block? What was municipal offices, and certain, I think it was not decided which department would go in.
Mm-hmm.
So, but also, and I think the unique thing is what I learned, that Mayor Menino, as Kairos said, bought a plot, what is not normal in the US, but also to put some public programming in it. So that was very unique, and that developed, as I remember, during the whole process.
So Kairos, why don't you take us through the competition and get us into the actual meat? Because I think what would be interesting, certainly for me now, is to think about the strategic questions that you were grappling with, and then the design responses that Francine was beginning to formulate on her side of the equation. What happened next? she won. She bid and she won, I assume.
Well,
Or
so
maybe it was
yeah,
more
well,
complicated.
what happened was that, first of all, the most important thing that the mayor did was to bring in the planning agency, which was the BRA, into a bid, a public tender or public bid for a public facilities projects, which is not normally open to competition the way that we understand competitions, like architectural competitions. So the mayor understood that this building couldn't just be another sort of normal municipal office building. And Francine was right. Back in 2008, we didn't actually know, the city hadn't determined what kind of use would be there. But the mayor was very tired of this notion of doing a long study and figuring out what exactly the building, who would occupy the building. He said, look, other developers, private developers, are able to actually advance projects without knowing all these things. The idea was, so the bottom line was the idea would be that the city would consolidate its offices and sell a more expensive plot near City Hall, and the sale of that property would subsidize essentially or provide revenues and funding to develop a new municipal office building in Dudley itself. And then during this process, we would figure out, the city would figure out who would occupy it. Now, eventually it became the school headquarters of the headquarters of the Boston Public Schools. But at that time, when we were actually putting out the bid for the competition, it wasn't known. It was generally thought about to be 110, 15,000 square feet. The one thing that we all knew and that the mayor was committed to was that it had to have active street frontage, really addressing some of the questions that you heard Francine talk about, which was Dudley, Washington Street, Warren Street desperately needed more activity and street life, and to actually make it a safer and a more vibrant location that could become the center of the neighborhood. That was the key.
I want to ask you a question because it's just occurring to my mind right now as I'm listening to you talk. In the 60s, I assume the urban renewal sort of project happened, where we get huge swaths of land and basically sort of bomb them out, knock down every building and then rebuild everything. And this seems to be a very different approach of actual development. The city comes in as a developer itself and tries to create economic activity around a building with some investment. I'm curious about your thoughts about the two different approaches. The sort of 1960s, we're going to do it all at once. And then in the 1990s, 2000s of, well, let's see if we can get a building. Let's see if we can get a parcel and do something with that parcel.
In fact, this is, the other two buildings that were talked about, which is the police station and the library branch and the municipal courthouse, which were all done in the late 60s and by mid 70s, all took a very different approach. And it was the kind of use government funding to do a series of buildings, not unlike a small government center down in Dudley. But all of these buildings were fortress-like, right? They were built with mostly kind of, you could associate with brutalism, right? No walls facing the streets, that contributed to the subsequent sort of 20, 30 years of denying the responsibility of buildings to streets. Now, the other important thing was that those buildings were truly single-use municipal buildings. So the police station was just for police, the library was just for the public library, the court was just for the court. The big deal, and why we needed actually a new kind of decision-making structure for the Dudley building, or the Ferdinand project, as we used to call it, is that it was always envisioned that there would be commercial uses on the ground floor. And, the public facilities department say, we don't do that. We can do police stations and we can do schools and libraries, but to put like merchants that would have commercial leases with the city, that's really difficult. So, the mayor had to basically convince everybody that this was really important, and because of that, he had to put a different kind of leadership team to shepherd this project and actually go away from the normal public tender process to a competition and to one that integrated more planning and more community input in the building of a public building. So your point about the government not behaving like a normal city agency, but behaving more like a private developer that would think about who the tenants are and to mix the tenants in order to actually create the kind of catalyst that was envisioned for the square.
So Francine, so you've heard Kairos sort of describe some of the thought process of the time, of the moment. Is that something you understood at the time you were applying for this, hoping to win this competition? With the complexity of sort of American urban development and the history of how we used to do it and how we're trying to do it now. Is that stuff you were aware of, or how did you sort your way through all those questions?
I was totally not aware of it, I think. So that's what I said. I felt comfortable because, it was for me my Dutch practice from the way I started. And what I remember, and maybe also Kairos remembers that, because he had only bought, the mayor had bought, or the city had bought only the Ferdinand building.
Right.
So I started to study, but this was impossible. So I said, you also, and I remember I have this nice picture going with all the models to the mayor, and we have this meeting with him together. I think we had a great team together. And so I said, in the Netherlands, I said to Mayor Menino, we would also buy these 2 other plots. And I think at the end he did that. And I think you told me, Kairos, that was very unique. He did it, but it was very essential. But the only funny thing is that at the end, I also had to keep the 2 facades. It was very complicated, but it's really nice.
Actually, what Francine said was really important. So the story, Sam, is that Francine hasn't told you, but after she and Sasaki were selected, right?
1 year later.
There was right soon after, it was the world financial crisis.
Nice. 2008, 2009, right? Around then.
So what happened was that the city, and there was a huge financial shock, and the CFO of the city basically said to the mayor, we can't do this. We have to put the project on hold.
Okay.
So we put the project on hold.
So I want to pause there for just a second, because this is one of the things I find so fascinating about planning. It's already been 10 years in process, and now it's got another hold on it for a little while. Is that, and the situation in Dudley is 30, 40, 50 years in process. So urban timelines tend to be very long.
Yeah. Well, but the hold was actually a reprieve in a sense, because many of the city departments said, great, we don't have to do this mixed-use building, right? But then what happened was that the mayor got re-elected in 2009. And then with the new chief of staff, Mitch Weiss, he convened the team again and basically saying, you know what, we need a economic stimulus plan, and Dudley is going to be where the mayor is going to start this thing up again. And along the way, we actually, the legal department convinced us that we couldn't just call up Francine and Sasaki and start it again, that because the building now had been reconceived from 110,000 square feet to potentially 120 or 140,000 square feet, that we had to rebid. So Francine, do you remember coming for a second interview? Because it was deemed that we could be in legal jeopardy because the scope of the project had changed from the time when we bid it first in early 2008 to, I think the rebidding was actually 2009, towards the end of 2009. Now,
I remember it was in the summer.
It was in the summer, so late summer, and we reconvened the selection committee, and fortunately, I guess Francine and Sasaki won the second time. So this was one of the few things that actually she had to win the competition twice in order to get the commission.
Well, we all know Francine is pretty impressive. So in that sense, we're not surprised. But here's a question maybe to you both. Did you reconceptualize, Francine, maybe this is to you first, did you reconceptualize the building? Did the building become a different kind of building in your mind, or was it the same building with modifications? How did
Oh,
you address
yeah.
that?
Maybe important, I made a kind of story. It was not really design. I had this idea that it should, because of course there was a risk that people would just come with an office block. And because in a way the brief was like that, and that was also a little bit for me the American tradition. And I said, walking around there, it's a triangle form. You want to reach out to the neighborhood. So I don't want any backside. I really wanted to reach out to the east, to the west, to the park, to the station. Of course, also that on Washington Street. I am a little bit, I'm bad in street names. So for me, that was important. So I was more talking about, was it Ferdinand Village?
Yes, Ferdinand Village.
Yeah, and that it should be jazzy. And so I think it was not really I made some ideas, but it was not designed what maybe these other architects maybe did. I have no idea, of course.
Can I just pause on something you just said? Because I think it's very interesting. You didn't want to have a backside to anybody or anything. I think you said that. And I'm fascinated by that. I'm also wondering, did you start to include the other side of the street in your design thinking? And did you start to create a village? Was what you're
actually, the thing about it is that I think Francine has a beautiful sketch that I think captivated the selection committee, which was a sketch that she wrote called Ferdinand Village. And she had this, a green carpet that covered all of the Ferdinand site and extended and included the Dudley station. So it was, in a way, that would have, in a normal competition, might have disqualified her.
Because it was too much. It was too much. It was reaching too far.
I took the whole plot. I even I remember. I can find that sketch. Yes,
I have it actually I have it, and I use it all the time, because it's one of those things that there were people on the selection committee who were more bureaucratic than I, that basically said, well, this project will never fly because we would have to actually get the state involved and take their land, or get them to throw in the bus station into it as well. But there's no question that I was on the selection committee, and I would just say that Francine's vision was about the kind of activity and place that she had envisioned that matched the city's vision most, whereas the other teams were focused more on a building. So the other teams were more, let's say, building oriented, and Francine's scheme was much more about placemaking and thinking about the square and its implication to the neighbors and to the life of the square. So, and I think it's a case study in many respects on how a competition can be won on an idea and a feeling, and communicating the feeling and the quality of place rather than the feeling and quality of a building.
Kairos, I understand you've got a couple of slides. You've just put one up. Just walk us through a couple of these. They're absolutely fascinating. What are we looking at here? What is this slide?
So this slide is actually a slide that Francine and Sasaki put together for the first competition. And it's interesting because Francine's image, I think, that captivated the selection committee was always much more than the building itself. And it was, so you can see this in the first triangle, the Ferdinand right at the corner, and then the two buildings that were later incorporated into the site that the city had not owned at the time, which is the Waterman Building and the Curtis Building in this corner where my cursor is. And then, of course, Francine's vision was to include all of the site adjoining that covered a green sort of this lyrical idea of a landscape that covered over the the two bus sheds, and integrating the center island that is now thought of as a village, and not as a single building, but from an aggregation of many elements that all activated the street and turn this into the heart of Dudley Square.
Oh, fascinating.
And I wanted to show also in the context
Yeah, please.
what the mayor's master plan was back in 2006, which there was always not just about a single building. I'm sorry about this.
No, it's okay.
But it was really about the notion of a series of redevelopment. And the first building actually that got off the ground was the rebuilding of the B2 police station to vacate the southern end of the old police station set right here, to move it away from the middle of the square, and then to redevelop Ferdinand Building as this major office and municipal facility, and then to really switch the entrance of the library from being on Warren Street to facing the square, and so that there would be this connection throughout the square and the bus station, and turn this into the middle and the heart, as opposed to being a kind of just a mobility hub that didn't connect to any of the surrounding buildings. So this is a plan that we actually generated right around 2007, before the competition, to show the community that this was really the Ferdinand was one of a series of steps to transforming Dudley Square. The last step of this multi-pronged public portion of the Dudley revitalization is putting this commercial parcel between the library and the police station, which is at the southern side of the bus station, up for public bid. And there is now a winning bid to develop a major residential project there that will again change the character of the square in a dramatic way. Now, in addition to these publicly sort of sponsored projects, there have been other important projects that we can talk a little bit about that was happening more or less at the same time that Ferdinand was being redeveloped.
Well, it's fascinating. You know, this is urban development, urban redevelopment, kind of at its absolute essence. I can't help but think of this, look at this image and think of a heart, of a human heart. It's right in the center. This is one of the oldest parts of Boston too. This is the old Boston Neck, where people used to come from the mainland out to the island, the peninsula of the Shawmut Peninsula, basically through here up Washington Street. And it's got sort of all the key components. It's got the Boston School Committee, the public schools. It's got a bus depot that used to be a train depot. It's got a public library. It really is a sort of the civic heart. Francine, I'm curious if you're looking at this image as well. What does it make you think about? You created one of the key pieces of this whole plan. What's your reaction to what we're looking at right now?
Yeah, it's because it's good that Kairos showed the this idea of the village, but in a way you can understand why I did that, because there was all these little buildings that they kept, and also the Curtis and Waterman. So that's why I started to make, hey, if there's all these collection of a village, but then the public space was very important. So I came up with this idea to have that above the bus station. And of course, I had also no clue, what I learned later, that it was really of different ownerships. And also I learned that it's the turning point of the buses from the city and from the state. So it was that part was state owned and that was city owned. You know, I didn't know all these issues. And that was maybe also good, because if you know too much, so I was very spontaneous and naive what I thought what should happen here. But for me it was very important, the philosophy, if Mayor Menino wants to bring here in a municipal office, that it's not just an office, that you bring in, what is it, 500 or 600 people working there. You want them to use bring economy. You want also the space to be used by the people of Roxbury. That was very much the philosophy. And also what I remember, what was for me very important, I started to walk around in the neighborhood and I saw, what's the name of the cafe?
Haley House.
The Haley, I discovered the Haley house.
Kairos, can you point to Haley House on your diagram?
So the Haley House is just outside, right here.
Interesting.
Right near the intersection of Melnea Cass and Washington Street.
And
So
for people who don't know it, what is Haley House? What is it?
So Haley House is a local bakery, but the most important thing was that the concept of Haley House was that it was a community, it was a local owner who actually hired, the staff were all locally hired, and many of them had Corey records. So it was a way and then it became a way. It became
for people
also,
who don't know Corey, that's criminal background. They have some
yes,
criminal issue in
so
their past.
many of the people from the neighborhood who have those kinds of records couldn't get jobs in other places. And it turned out that as a place of actually training many of these folks, that then it also became a place where community services, and I think it had a soup kitchen. So it was a really center part of a very, and the mayor used to always stop for breakfast at Haley House. So, you know, and the Haley House manager was on the community, what we call the Dudley Visions Task Force, that was working with the city to actually shepherd this project through.
So Kairos, I want to use that as an opportunity to talk about we're going to go back to the building now. Talk a little bit, both of you, about the issues around, first of all, this internal public space, which Francine described, of using the interior of the building to create a public venue, in effect. And then this mix of commercial on the ground floor, municipal, governmental upstairs. You've already alluded to it. It sounds like that was always going to be a challenge. It probably always is a challenge, but how did it work out? How did you all figure it out?
Francine, do you want to talk about the fact that when we started talking about that we had to do a tour? The only other public building that we thought fit that bill right at that time was the state's transportation building.
Oh yeah.
In the theater district. And so we all took a tour, especially with the city folks in the public facilities department, to say, well, look, if the state transportation department could develop a building like this in the 90s, surely the city could figure out how to do a similar building. And if you know the building, I don't know that it has a name, but the transportation building it's on Neelan Street or Stewart Street on one side, and then it has multiple entrances. And at that time, that was one of the big debates. Remember, Francine, that we wanted actually at least three entrances: one on Washington Street, one on Warren Street, and then one that faced the bus station. And there was a long sort of struggle, right, to just about the entrances to the building and what that would mean for a public building. How could they manage it? And so, you know, it was a real struggle.
What were the issues involved? Because we've all dealt with bureaucracies. Sometimes they get very focused on what the rule is that's written down in a book somewhere. But what from a design urban perspective, what was the goal and what was the pushback against it? What were the challenges?
I think the pushback is just the management and what would happen if you create. I mean, look, I think back in the first part of the 21st century, it's fair to say that there is a lot of, let's say, street activity in Dudley Square that people in City Hall just said, well, do we want to create and be the host and invite more of that street activity into a public space that we have to own and manage, right? And it was really a kind of negative way of looking at street life. And instead, I think the success of this building was that it was able to create an interior public space that actually has turned out to be very well used and well managed. And in fact, I think is not a deterrent, but it has actually elevated the kind of family and community-based activity, and it's spilled out into the streets. and has had a very positive effect on the street activities and life of Dudley Square.
And
So,
maybe if I
yeah.
can add to this, car, can I? I'm talking. Yeah, add this to this car. I remember walking through Boston, and I thought, you know, the only way they can think of indoor spaces is like food courts. But I didn't want a food court, so I wanted to have it educational or cultural. Because at the same time, there was activities I remember in Roxbury, like a film festival or they had little festivals, and I also wanted to create almost like already an educational space, almost like the way I design libraries.
The one thing we haven't gotten is Francine to comment on her building. As I said, I think it's truly a beautiful building. But
So can
Kairos,
you
go
see
ahead.
the interior of the space now?
Yes, I can see it.
And I think if you look at the space, so on the right hand side, this is the idea that people can just sit there or study or, you know, work there. We did design the stairs very wide way, so very generous that you can also have an. I remember there was with the opening, was it with the choir singing there?
The choir on the stairs, yes.
Yeah. Or you can also see on the ceiling. So we made these wooden slats, but in between are theatrical lights, so that it's prepared to, you know, to have it, yeah, for theater performance. I have no clue if they used it for that already. And also, what was important, if you look at the left-hand side, what is the curved wall, that it's not a totally glass facade. So for acoustic reasons, but also to give some protection from the inside. Otherwise, you were very much facing the street, almost the buses drive through your building otherwise. So that to enclose it and still get enough daylight in it was very essential. And of course, the blue wall, the most discussed wall of Boston, maybe. So we really did design and made this nice map of all the neighborhoods of Boston's for school kids, if they come here, that they would recognize their own neighborhood where they were coming from. So that that map is not just Roxbury, it's all of Boston.
I think it's just beautiful.
I think I have some. So here's the.
Yes,
here's
the exterior. I was just going to ask, do you have any exterior shots? Go.
So
Sorry.
let's talk about the three corners.
Sure.
Yeah.
So this is Washington Street coming towards the square.
Yeah, yeah. So this is. I think it's really nice. It's really still very beautiful. So this is the original building, and where there are these circular windows is also where the committee room is. The
school committee meeting
school,
room.
Yeah.
But comment, this prow of the ship is the Ferdinand building, or that's the facade of the Ferdinand building.
Yeah.
Which was, Kairos, you'll know more than me. It was a 19th century department store, something like that.
Well, yes, it was a furniture store that was around since the end of the 19th century, and it had closed by the time Mayor Menino became the mayor, and bought by a local landowner developer called Guscott, Mr. Guscott, who owned the building adjacent, and he was constantly trying to figure out how to get the public to help him develop it. But he would, and eventually the city ended up buying the property from him through eminent domain. But I would say the one thing about this approach was, I think, Francine, the success of this facade is that it doesn't look like the new building doesn't overwhelm the old building, right? I mean, and so it looks like a collection of complicated mass that recognize and gave the due respect to the original building.
Well, Francine, would you talk about the building that you designed, not the Ferdinand facade, but the other part of it?
Do you want me to show the next slide?
Sure.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
So this is also the old building, the Waterman building from the police station, I mean, from the bus station. And then this is the third corner that was really from Francine designed, right? And added to.
Yeah, it was very complicated, I remember, what to do with the third corner, because the other two corners were very dominated with, the existing buildings. And so this was, should it be totally brick or should we make it special? But in a way, it was also nice to express the three corners as reaching out to the neighborhood. That was the idea. And in between, at the same time, if you look at the horizontal lines, it's very much influenced by the Ferdinand building or the layering of a classical building, with a plinth, and then here you can see that. So we really tried to balance this and then make a crown on the top. What is in the US, you have a lot of mechanical equipment, I can tell you. So that top floor on the backside is what is nice in the sculpturality, to be honest.
Kairos, what are we looking at here?
So
Amazing.
this is
Nice.
during
Yeah.
construction, when you can see the historic facades, the Ferdinand building facade being supported while the excavation was occurring, and then the Waterman facade and the Curtis building facade with their own basements that were finally incorporated into the site. So you see the outline of the building, and then this little in between the Ferdinand and the Curtis is where the public space occurred.
Yeah.
So I mean, I have Francine, you can talk about this, because the notion of the three corners and the jazzy connector.
Yeah. So it was very, and the sculpturality, and also it's funny on this in the picture in the middle. We wanted to keep that one wall because it was written on it, the Ferdinand, or it was yeah. So we really kept that wall because it was very important. And I remember at the end we had to take the paint off because there was lead in the paint. Do you remember that? And I was very disappointed.
Yes, I do remember that.
Because it was a very expensive wall, to keep. We kept the wall because of the paint, and at the end we had to take the paint away. But okay. But here you can see how I called it, so you have the three corners and the old facades of the three buildings. So I call the rest a kind of cement and a jazzy cement to connect all of it in a kind of complexity. The jazzy, it's sculptural. I think also, as I told you, when I came the first time, I felt the city, this part of the city, it feels through the people very energetic. So I also selected a stone what is reflecting. It's a very hard stone. It's a kind of, I don't know the name of it anymore, but also with all the light and the buses around it, so it reflects. So the light reflects beautiful, I think, in the building in the evening, but also at daytime. And that's because of the materiality of it and the sculpturality. It's also beautiful made. We made this nice movie of the masonry, the bricklayers making the building. They did a great job, and we did teach them how to do it. Because I also come from a bricklayer country, it was also this, I called it Boston bricks with a Dutch touch. So it's a kind, Boston had a brick tradition, but also my own country. So, to play with that, and it's an American brick, was for me very much, it was important.
Absolutely beautiful. In the time we have left, for this episode, and Kairos, I want to thank you for sharing these slides. We should have started them sooner. They're just brilliant. What from each of you, what do you think, what do you feel the impact of this project has been, is being right now? What did you accomplish by doing this? Kairos, you want to start?
Well, I mean, there's no for me, the willingness of the city to take the risk of actually putting, and actually the largest public city building built since the city hall itself in downtown, right, in Government Center, was this building, and to do it in a place where really the public investment in a place that really could use it and has benefited from it is important. The public space, the integration of the bus station and the two streets, and the integration of commercial use and inviting the public into the building. Now, I mean, when we talk about the great Coleman Mecanoo City Hall building, I think the one thing everybody says is that it doesn't have any public use, right? Yes, you do your business there, but if you can imagine that we took the same attitude about the public-facing ground levels in the same way in Government Center as we did here in Dudley, I think that's the key. And I think that it's no question, since this building was open, it's only been open for 6 years, but in the 6 years time, the number of private development and the interest in actually adding to the community quality and community investment in Dudley Square, it's undeniable. So I would say it's a great success. It's probably Mayor Menino's, one of his probably most important community building legacy. I mean, of course, that puts a short change on the many other things he did for the communities, but this is the most visible and largest example of it.
That's absolutely stunning. Francine, what's your takeaway? What do you feel you accomplished in this project, in this building you designed and saw built?
I think it's very unique that it happened. So it's really also, I think the Dutch experience really brought this to also, but I think the mixture of this. I have this picture of this whole team sitting together with the mayor. Do you remember, Kairos?
Yes, I do remember. I remember that meeting.
and also the way Thomas Menino was sitting on his chair. But it was really this team bringing it together.
Yeah, this was probably the most important design meeting we had with the mayor, and it was after working with Francine's team for several months, and that we had really the concept of Francine had developed the concept, and we were using this as a way of making the argument to the mayor that the project would be 100 times better if we just took this 2 other buildings. And you can see that, it was unusual. It's unusual for somebody like Chris Gordon, whom you see here, right? Who's standing next to me. He was brought in as a special advisor to the mayor to actually coordinate between the BRA, the Public Facilities Department, and the various, and the mayor's office and the CFO's office to make sure that this project stayed on pace. And I would say that without the mayor creating that special decision-making structure, this building would not have been built.
Well, I want to say, I'm just going to add that it's hard to explain to people who aren't in this world just how difficult it is to get anything done in a city, even in a city as forward-thinking as Boston, with the goal of getting something done. It's just so complicated. And to have this project be the result of your work, Kairos, and your work, Francine, is just, it's hard to describe what it is, but it's almost a work of art all by itself. It's almost a piece of performance art that left a building as its result. It's absolutely stunning. Anybody who hasn't been to this building needs to go. It's truly a beautiful, beautiful building that is forming the anchor, the keystone of this crucial neighborhood in Boston. Absolutely fascinating. I want to just take this opportunity to thank you both for spending time with us on Unplanned. Fascinating story. So many more stories to tell from it, but there's only so many minutes on Unplanned that we can have. So Kairos, thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
And Francine, thank you.
Thank you, Sam, and Kairos.
Yeah, thank you, Francine. Nice to see you. And we should do this again some other time.
Yes, and I hope I can travel to Boston again. Every time I come to Boston, I always visit the building.
Well, I will say, please come back and visit all of us, because we'd love to see you, and we'll all go down to the building together. That would be great.